Well, that's all soldered back in place. I'm going to put that little leather mirror buffer back in position. Just take a little bit of adhesive. Take this, lay it in place. Just get that centered up. That's sitting nicely. Now where my flash connection is there, I'm just going to put a blob of black paint on that to cover that up. And the black paint will also serve to keep that fibre washer from shifting, because I don't see any point in gluing that down first. Here we go, pretty as a picture. Right, so the shutter release. Well, I've got my release here, that's all clean and ready to go. I've got the screws here, but the spring was mutilated. So I'm going to find a new spring for that, one that's not mutilated. Oh, I think I have a close match. Let's have a look. It might be a bit short. I'll go back for another look. Now I think we're cooking with gas. I think that'll do nicely. So let's pop that into position. And the shutter release arm, I will wipe that very lightly with a bit of molybdenum paste. And see if I can wiggle this thing into position. That looks like it. That moves smoothly. Let's try and get some impression of how strong that is, but it may be stronger than it needs to be. Yeah, I'll see if I can find a lighter spring. I don't quite like the feel of that one. Yeah, I found another one. I'm quite happy with the feel of that. That's nice and smooth. I think that'll be great. So that shutter is really ready to mount back to the camera body. And the camera body is nearly ready for that too. So I better get the camera body back in here and see about preparing it. Right. The shaft. Front pinion, the cam, and what else do we want here? Oh, we've got our washers, our 8 washers. I think they changed from using 8 washers to using 12 washers because presumably they wanted more tension on that front panel, pushing it outwards against the screws where you adjust it with a focus adjustment for the depth of mount to film plane distance. Here's our 4 screws. In order to do this job I'm going to require 2 more longer screws, so we'll start with this. Looking at my cam, you can always see on these where the wear pattern is. It buffs through the finish, the black finish there. And you just need to make sure that that part gets lubricant. And I'm using molybdenum paste here, but you could use graphite grease. You could probably use other things as well. This is where the levers for the capping plate and mirror run. I'll put a little bit of synthetic grease on the pinion gear at the back too, where that runs on the cocking rack, and get this into position. Now, the correct orientation, it's not engaged with the cocking rack yet. The correct orientation is round about, not there, 1 tooth back from that. See if I can get that right. Oh, it's hard wriggling that in. There. And look at the angle. That's the correct angle. Alright, so next, the pinion for the front. And the cam surface round here operates the lever that releases the mirror. I've got to get that in position. And you can't really see what's going on here with this top cover. I'm going to take this off and put the little short piece on so this isn't obscuring your view. Well, I've just fought with this and I thought I was recording, but I wasn't. This pinion here, the tension on that spring needs to be about 1.5 turns. Basically, as soon as you've got some resistance with the tail of the spring up here, you need another full turn. So I've got that sitting there, that's correctly placed. It's under tension. The tail of the spring is held by this bracket that I'd put on earlier. Now, before I get too far ahead of myself, I've got to put my mirror back into here, into the tray. Also, I'd carefully put that aside so it wouldn't get damaged. So I've got to find my mirror and put it back. Well, the mirror's in, that's all ready to go. There was a speck of dust on there and I was able to get that off. It was sticky. I don't know what it was, but it was stuck on there. With a cotton bud and some CRC Lectraclean, I was able to encourage it off without damaging the mirror, which is a minor miracle. So, the washers, these springy washers need to go in here. These are vaguely cup shaped. They need to be put in opposed pairs so that they provide the maximum amount of tension. Later cameras had 3 spring washers in each position. This is an earlier one that only has 2. Well, it was probably an earlier one that originally had only 2. I don't know that for sure. It's possible that whoever put the front on last time couldn't handle the idea of 3 washers in each position. Right, washers are all placed, everything's sitting there. The meter drum is sitting in the correct position where we left it. Our shutter's ready to go in. This arm needs to go in that gap. To lower this in so that it runs over the cable drum at the bottom. All this to be done without disturbing your washers. Pull back the chrome trim at the top a little bit. Push the mirror in to get that seated underneath the mirror buffer strip. Make sure my washers are aligned at the bottom and put 2 of the original screws in those positions. This is a job that you may need to do much more than once. So patience is good. Don't rush it. And don't get overly frustrated if it doesn't go right the first time. I'm putting 2 longer screws through at the top here just to hold it, just to make sure my washers don't get away. At the moment the gears are not coupled at the top here because the front's not pushed on far enough. Okay, so now the washers can't get away. I can stand my camera up. Check that the mirror is not trapped. Push the pinion across here. Now that dropped into engagement. Or feels like it's not, it may not be quite engaged. Let me give that a nudge on the end of that little internal rack. No, that didn't do anything. If I hold down my lock lever there, because I haven't got a frame counter on this. Yeah, it's just started. I can start cocking this. The shutter is cocked. Let's see if it releases. It did. Okay. So the position's correct. I'll run those 2 screws at the bottom down lightly. That was the best possible result. That you get it correctly meshed on the first attempt. But that's not common. Probably on average you're going to take 2 shots to do each one. And for every one that goes on the first hit, you're probably going to have to take 3 attempts at another one. Okay, so I've got my 4 screws are in there. They're only very lightly done up, but that's ready to go. I'm going to remove this bracket, which we no longer need. I'm going to put the full length top back on here so that I've got my frame counters being holding down that lock lever. And this will hold everything in place while I do all the rest of the things I need to do on the front of the camera. Once you have the front fully installed, you're usually loath to take the thing off again because you've disturbed the meter and had the cord run off the drums. So having a top cover on there is a great thing. stops that meter getting away. Okay, so what have we got now? I'll just check my shutter. Cocks nicely, fires nicely. That sounds very good. I've got to set my lens to film, or lens mount to film plane distance. First I'll get these screws started up a little bit. Because we've only got 2 washers here, it's very easy to move this. I'm going to put a cable release on here, open the shutter on B and set my film plane, lens mount to film plane distance. Put a cable release on there. Shutter is now held open, you can see right through front to back. It's hard finding something black in a dark box. This was an old pressure plate that I've modified to sit here where the film would sit. It's been relieved here so that it sits down on the rails. Now I use a depth gauge to get my distance from the lens mount here to the film plane, which should be 47.6 millimeters. Gauge. Now let's see how we get on. .69, 47.7, 47.66, 47.68. Okay, so we've got to move all of those, do those screws up tighter. And I'll just go round these, adjusting as I go until I get them all to read 47.6. .62, 47.63, 47.61, 61, 75. Well, we haven't tightened this side up at all. Right, I'll work my way around here until they all say the same thing. Well, that's all reading correctly. I'm pleased with the state of that. Now this little shaft with its pinion on the end needs to go in. This has to couple with the drum. It's sometimes tricky to get this to engage. Let's see if we can get this to go for us. Yep, it's just dropped in. That went probably smoother than generally. I'll put a smear of molybdenum paste through the centre of that. That shutter is ready to have the front control rings fitted back. So I better find them. Now, rather unusually, there's some sort of coating on this ring here, which is where this ring that opens the diaphragm runs. And it's got a grey look to it. It's obviously something that was put there intentionally. I can only think that it was some sort of graphite loaded coating that was intended to reduce friction at that point. It's a bit unusual. I don't recall seeing one like that before. But experiments were obviously made during production. I've got to clean all this anyway because it's a bit sticky with old grease. I've got to get rid of all that old grease and get all this nice and clean, and then I can lubricate it the way I want to lubricate it, which is typically with graphite powder for that front ring to get that running right. That's the Aperture scale ring. Interestingly, the Voigtlander Besomatics, which use the same basic shutter system, although it's inverted in their case, cocks from the other end, they don't have a spring to return the aperture setting dial. They don't have one on the shutter. They must rely on other parts of their mechanism to do that job. Okay, let's wipe that surface. That looks good. Here's our aperture scale. That's good. You have to hook that little hook onto the end of the spring, and then you stretch the spring out slightly so it's under tension, and get that little tab in there. Now that tab sets the aperture on your lenses. Okay, well that moves freely enough. I'll lubricate that with a bit of graphite powder. Here's the shutter speed setting ring, and I'm just checking the state of this, making sure it's not cracked. The plastic tabs often get cracked, particularly if they've been working hard, and typically they've been working hard because this mechanism was gummed up with dried grease, and so people are having to swing on their controls more than they should do. So I've got to get rid of any traces of old grease from in here. I'm going to be cautious about what you do in the way of solvents. Those plastic tabs on the shutter speed scale here, they do not like solvent. I don't even think you can wipe them with naphtha. They're just obviously some plastic that doesn't like it. This is the ring that cocks your lens. It basically forces the aperture, forces your lens to full aperture when you cock the shutter. You can see there's quite a bit of grease or something on there. There's this piece. This has got a little gear on it there, and basically means it couples to the shutter and the aperture settings so that those dials counter-rotate. So at any given setting of the metering system, you move your shutter speed setting one way and the aperture would move the other way to compensate, so that your exposure would remain correct. That moves quite freely. I'll give that a puff of graphite, work it in and blow it out, and that should be good. That's moving quite freely. I'm just going to run a little bit of molybdenum paste, a smear of molybdenum paste around the outside rim of this and where the wheels will run. Very light. I don't intend to do much here. Let's get this in position. There's a notch which allows it to fit over that little pinion. Slide that on and this rotates. Is the teeth in that aperture settings. We'll have to line up with this little cog here, of course. Now, at the end of the chain right there, at the end of that cutout in the brass, they should line up with that notch there in the case. Here's our shutter speed settings ring. Now the shutter speed on the camera setting has to engage and disengage from this at the B setting. So I'm running some molybdenum paste in that notch there. I'll show you how that works on the camera. So basically, hang on, my meter's picking up screws and stuff because the meter of course has a big magnet in it. Okay, so basically at the end of the scale there, we're at the B setting. If you move it around this way, it just moves the tab on the shutter to change the speeds. If you move it around the other way, it disconnects from the shutter so that the ring's moving independently. And that's so that you can have B at one or other of your aperture settings. Okay, so that's how that works, and that's all in place. There's two ways you can deal with this. You can set this ring in place first, which I'm going to do in this case. That's sitting in the B position. This piece, I've got to make sure that the notch is lined up as I've mentioned. The piece that cocks our lenses, it has to drop in there, and the third tooth should line up with the pinion. There's a small gap there at the end of that channel. Holding this in position, I've now got to fit this to the camera, getting that pinion down that hole without disturbing anything and getting it all seated. It looks like I succeeded on the first attempt, which would be a very nice thing if you could do that every day. The long screw goes down in that position. There are 3 screws. One of them is much longer than the others. And I'm fairly confident that just locks down into the shutter to stop the focus mount from having any inclination to rotate when you're fitting lenses. I'll do those 3 screws up. You see, as I cock the shutter, this arm comes down and that would open the lens up to maximum aperture, and as you release the shutter that would fly back up, allowing the lens to close down to the set aperture, which is controlled over here. And you'll see as I change this wheel, moving the aperture, that changes the setting there on that tab, which would change it directly on the lens. That looks promising. If I set this mid-range, as I counter-rotate, as I move the shutter speed here, as I move the shutter speed, you'll see that the apertures counter-rotate, so we would maintain the same meter setting, the same exposure. Right, well, I've got to go away and find out whether this meter's accurate now. I've simply put everything back where I found it. That doesn't necessarily mean that was the right place for it. Hopefully it will be. But I'll go and test this on my calibrated light source and find out. Wish me luck. Well, the exposures meter looks good within half a stop. I think that I'll make my adjustment by shifting the diaphragm ring at the front of the camera rather than make my adjustment by moving the cord on the drum at the top of the camera, because disturbing that cord can lead to disaster. If things don't go right, you could break the cord. If you break the cord, of course, all of this work has to come off again, because the front's got to come off the camera to run new cord. So I think I'll make my adjustment by shifting the aperture ring. And that can certainly work, and because I'm half a stop out, I'm fairly confident that they've got a good chance I can hit that right on the money. But it won't be today.